The Olympus E-M1 Mark II has been quite a divisive camera in the Micro Four Thirds lineup, on account of its high, Olympus might say premium, pricing. The original E-M1 was considerably cheaper when introduced, and at well over twice the price of Olympus's E-M5 Mark II and Panasonic's G80, the Mark II has a lot to prove. It has a raft of headline features, like a 60 frame per second RAW sequence mode, with up to 14 frames captured before you press the shutter, 2 SD card slots, an improved 20 megapixel sensor covered in 121 phase detection points, a 50 megapixel high definition capability, an extra large battery with fast charging, an updated menu system, latest Type-C fast USB connection, 4K video, and as if that's not enough, it has a handsome chiseled body that comes only in Charisma Pro Black. I can see George Clooney toting this camera to a premiere and the crowd muttering, "Who's that with the Olympus?" But looks and specs aside, how is the M1 Mark II as a camera, and can it justify its elevated price point? Let's take a look. I've mentioned that it looks great, a classic DSLR-styled body. The mainly metal, weather-sealed body is quite heavy, surprisingly so even without the super-sized high-capacity battery fitted, but still small and light by DSLR standards. Overall size and weight is 12% more than a Panasonic G80, but they're close enough in looks and feel that I often picked up one and didn't realise it was the other until I looked. The controls are laid out much like the M1, on the basis that it wasn't broken, so don't fix it. There's Olympus's 2-position lever with the exposure and focus lock button in the middle, push buttons either side of the on-off switch, which give access to metering, focusing modes, HDR and all the capture modes, from single shot to pro capture, and high resolution shooting. There's provision for a battery grip, although the camera fits the hand so well that I don't imagine it could improve the handling. Rather just add longer shooting time, plus a mic and external power input. There are 2 buttons at the front of the camera which fall nicely under the fingers, plus the usual dials and wheels common to digital cameras these days. There's no built-in flash, but Olympus supply a very neat separate one, which 2 minutes with a file renders usable on Panasonic bodies as well. In use, it feels as good as it looks. You're in no doubt that this is a tough, quality-built camera, and the controls fall nicely under the fingers. It has the same cobby, purposeful air as the old Nikon F and F2 film cameras used to have, before they brought in Giorgio Giario to style the cameras. I can't tell you how excited grizzled war photographers and horny-handed Fleet Street hacks were at the prospect of their work tools coming with a red designer stripe down the front and a champagne colour finish. The articulated screen, while maybe not as quick to deploy as a swiveled one, makes up for it by being useful in portrait mode instead of just landscape like its predecessor. The mode dial now has 3 custom positions for instant access to previously chosen settings. There is a dazzling array of shooting mode options, from single shot right through to the new Pro Capture, which not only lets you fire at 60 frames per second, but lets you shoot up to 14 frames before you even press the shutter. It sounds miraculous, but in reality the camera starts buffering frames when you half press the shutter, and records them when you press it fully for the start of your sequence. Panasonic have already done this with their 4K photo modes, but the difference, and I assume the reason for the Pro Capture name, is that the M1 Mark II will actually do it in RAW as well as full-size JPEG. The 2 SD card slots don't just double the storage. You can set them to RAW in one, JPEG the other, basically any combination you want, but only the top one will accommodate the high-speed cards necessary for 4K video. I like RAW in one and fine JPEG in the other, giving me a backup if one card fails, but particularly for Adobe Lightroom, meaning I don't have to separate RAW from JPEG ready to import. We have a 25 and 50 megapixel high-resolution facility for detailed subjects, and useful for product shots or maybe large landscape prints. There is no shock-free shutter design like the Panasonic, but we have the usual and effective electronic front curtain arrangement, which does a similar job. And of course there is the fully electronic shutter, which eliminates all possibility of shock, but with the danger of some distortion for fast-moving subjects. The shutter now goes up to an astonishing 1/32,000th of a second. So if you could catch it, an image of a bullet from a .45 would only be slightly blurred, having travelled just 1/3 of an inch or 8mm in that exposure time. The stabilisation is now up to 5.5 stops claimed, with 6.5 stops with the new 1200mm Pro lens with its own internal stabilisation added. I can't test that 5.5 stops figure, but it is certainly the best stabilisation I've used, and 5 stops can be taken for granted at least. In use it can feel a little uncanny. When you half press the shutter button, the stabilisation kicks in, and it's as if an invisible hand has taken the camera from you. The EVF is sharp, bright and clear, ditto the monitor. Where video is concerned, we have a raft of possibilities. 4K Cinema 4096 by 2160 is available with a 24 frames per second frame rate. The more common 4K 3840 by 2160 at 30, 25 and 24 frames per second, and Full HD 1920 by 1080 in everything from all intra to a low bitrate normal quality. Full stabilisation is available in video too, which makes hand-holding a cinch. The shutter release doesn't have a very well delineated halfway press, which means that it is very easy to fire off a shot or burst of images when all you intended to do was focus and wait. I don't like the complete silence of the electronic shutter, and it really needs an option to add a sound, so that you get a feel for when the shutter is actually firing. The menu system has allegedly been improved, but really it's just a tweak when the system really needs a top-to-bottom rewrite. However, with so many physical buttons and settings, delving into the menu can mostly be avoided. But let's cut to the chase. The bête noire of Micro Four Thirds has always been the continuous autofocus. The system's single autofocus is nowadays close to instantaneous, and down into very low light too. While improvement may be possible, it isn't really necessary, certainly not a priority. Continuous autofocus is different. There's a myth that it is bad, mainly held to by DSLR users with no experience of mirrorless cameras. But it isn't as good as the best DSLRs, with their dedicated phase detection centres. And while Panasonics are evolving towards DSLR performance with their depth from deep focus database, Olympus has fallen a little behind, their E-M1 with its first for Micro Four Thirds phase detection pixels being 3 years old now. I'll come clean here. I wouldn't buy an E-M1 Mark II because it has a bigger battery, a 20 megapixel sensor or twin SD card slots, or 50 megapixel high res, or even that remarkable 60 frame per second burst mode. High speed shooting is of very limited use if focus is set when you press the shutter, as it is on all the M1 Mark II's high speed modes. How many of us really want to produce a picture sequence limited to one focus point? How many of us want to produce sequences of pictures at all? The holy grail is to follow a moving subject in the finder and maintain sharp focus on it however fast or erratic its movement, firing off a frame or burst of them whenever something picture-worthy occurs. In a football game, that means keeping focus locked on the player who has the ball, a motor race on a chosen car, and for the headbangers who photograph birds in flight, well, sharp focus at all is a minor miracle. The costly E-M1 Mark II stands or falls by its ability to perform in the action arena. At the outset, let me excuse my pictures here by admitting that I have no love for sport, and my idea of photographic action is walking to the photographic studio's canteen to get a black coffee for a hungover rock star. So, does it stand or does it fall? Here are sequences of cyclists approaching, turning and coming close. I shot about 2,800 frames all in all. They are at the highest L setting, with the mechanical shutter, 10 frames per second, using the 9-point focus grid centrally placed, stabilisation off, as are all the tests including soccer and the birds. The lens was the 40-150 Pro zoom set variously to f2.8, f4 and 5.6. The aperture setting made no difference to the consistency of results, so extra depth of field was not necessary to obtain sharp results. You can have 15 or 18 frames per second with the electronic shutter, but mild though the jello effect is, it is still enough to potentially spoil a picture. I also find that the 15 or 18 times a second blanking of the EVF as it exposes, a bit like driving a car down a tree-lined road on a sunny day, stroboscopic effect, slightly disorientating. Anyway, 10 frames a second is plenty for most sports. I found the full focus grid a little too inclined to focus on the background, and the centre ones just a little bit too small, making them difficult to keep on the subject. This camera cries out for Panasonic's custom focus points facility to get full advantage of its capabilities. The crucial frames in these sequences are the point where the bike is changing direction and the camera was computed. This was the Achilles heel of the Panasonic G80, where there would often be 2 to 4 frames off focus at this point before it picks up focus again. The Olympus had a few focus glitches here as well, but while they were frequent with the G80, with the Olympus they were very much less frequent, and not as far off focus, still being usable if not ideal. An example of the robustness of the CAF is shown here when the view is obscured by a car. It maintains sharpness until the view is almost totally obscured, and then, essentially starting from scratch, takes just 3 frames to orient itself, 1 semi-sharp and then back to pin sharp. Very impressive. Next, here are some soccer shots with example sequences. These are all at f2.8 on my 40-150 f2.8 Olympus zoom, with a shutter speed of around a 2000th and 3200 ISO. The Olympus makes light work of this kind of thing, humans on foot being relatively slow. It yields an impressive range of pin-sharp action pics under these circumstances, the limitation really being the ability of the photographer to predict and follow the action in the EVF. Here I found the 5-point grid best, the full grid being, understandably, unable to predict what player I wanted to concentrate on in the melee of bodies. Even so, it made a commendable stab at it, but still with a tendency to focus on the background. I'd say that for sport, skillfully used and taking advantage of the lens's function button to engage and disengage focusing, the back button style, the M1 Mark II is performing along with the DSLRs. And now the birds. If I'm honest, of the 3,100 frames I shot of these gulls in flight, I'd have felt I'd done well if I had 100 sharp ones. Because gulls are so common, their thrillingly acrobatic flight, ability to turn on a wingtip, and their sheer speed of reaction is often overlooked. These pics again are on the Big Pro zoom. It could have been made for this camera really. ISO 1600, f4 with shutter speeds around a 6000th, and focal lengths from 70 to 150mm. I thought that making sequences would be haphazard at best, but provided I could centralise the image long enough for the camera to know where to focus and, more difficult, keep it there, the Olympus would hold on to it. What I wanted though was even more taxing. I wanted close-ups of the birds in flight as they swooped to take food. Given that they only held position for a fraction of a second, too short for single focus to nail them, the only way was to track them as they approached for a second or two, and fire off a few frames as they filled the frame in the hope that something would turn up. Of these close-up shots, I would have been happy with 5 successes. Actually, I had a large choice, as I'm showing here. I'm not impressed, I'm gobsmacked. So much for the CAF capabilities. I had to have a little go with the Pro Capture at full steam 60 frames per second. I decided I'd try to get a pic with a cyclist almost exactly coincident with the round sign near. I shot an awful lot of sequences using the pre-frame capture and only got 2 frames exactly as I wanted. 60 frames per second is a lot, but if you're aiming for a very precise placement, it's not a slam dunk to get it. On the other hand, left to my own devices, I wouldn't have got it at all. So, worth having, but I can't see most photographers using it in their daily work. What's good is that it works with RAW files and JPEG and all combinations thereof. I've got a frame rate of 49 frames per second with RAW and 47 with RAW and JPEG together. Note the Pro Capture is only available with Olympus lenses. Now the 20 megapixel sensor. Here it is compared to the Panasonic GX8s. These are direct from the RAW files, ISO 3200, no post-processing. The Olympus has less noise than the Panasonic, but the Panasonic has more detail. It's as if Olympus was employing noise reduction on their RAW, which would be an odd thing to do. Regardless, for non-pixel peepers, IQ is all but the same. The high-resolution options are 25 megapixels and 50 megapixels, and while limited to essentially still subjects, could be handy for product photographers who might be asked for large files for poster use, say. 50 megapixels being good for at least a 40-inch print. Unashamedly a stills camera primarily, the E-M1 Mark II is no slouch when it comes to video. PAL and NTSC frame rates are catered for, as is 24 frames per second cinema and 4K ultra high definition. There is all intra uncompressed video, which like 4K cinema will need a fast card to keep up with the peak data throughput. This clip was shot at 3200 ISO in 4K. For close-up stills in the dim light of my blues club, my impression is that the camera is less effective than Panasonic model. I don't think it's down to inferior focusing in any way, more that the autofocus area selections are less flexible. Face or eye priority focusing isn't appropriate under these conditions, because the subject is often turning away from or profile to the camera. The full array will tend to drift off focus onto the mic or the hat. It can't know what you want. The central 509 grid array makes a choice within their cluster. With a close-up like this, often puts the focus slightly away from where you want it. Not by much, but with a 150mm lens at f2.8, not much is too much. The centre position is best, but being small on a close-up like this can easily be on an area lacking contrast, causing the focus to hunt and miss picture. What is really needed is the central position, but with adjustable size, as Panasonic has. Then you can enlarge it just enough to retain adequate fineness of focus, while giving it more area and therefore more contrast to work with. I'm being harsh here, but this is an expensive camera. Back with the continuous autofocus. In a nutshell, this is the best CAF on any Micro Four Thirds camera. And while it is not in a different league to Panasonic's depth from defocus, the difference is pronounced, repeatable, and lives up to Olympus's claims. If you need reliably sharp action images from a Micro Four Thirds camera, this is the one. I can't try them all, but sticking my neck out, I doubt there is a mirrorless camera of any flavour that would surpass this one for feathered subjects. So, a great performer. Where does that leave us overall? In many ways, this camera is hitting technological buffers. The sensor is at the limit of what can be done with Micro Four Thirds format for now, which is why there is no big breakthrough on image quality. While you can shoot pro sequences of 99 RAW or even RAW plus JPEG, it takes time to write them to the SD card from the buffer, and fast as the writing is, the camera is dormant for a period. If I was covering a soccer match, that would be the time I'd be missing pictures. I also read that with the 12 to 100mm Olympus lens, the 6.5 stop stabilisation available is the theoretical maximum attainable because it's limited by the rotation of the planet itself. Now that's what I call state of the art. The big question though is the E-M1 Mark II worth the money? Some people will always want the best regardless. Others want value for money. Some will consider the build quality, the 50 megapixel high-res imaging, the twin SD slots, the best of any camera stabilisation, the 20 megapixel sensor, and the 4K video, in combination or of themselves, offer value for money, and the CAF capability is the icing on the cake. The reality is that with all man-made objects, there is a law of diminishing returns. An improvement is disproportionately expensive beyond a certain point. However, any camera that can make me look like a competent bird or sports photographer must be worth a premium. If you photograph fast-moving, difficult subjects regularly and want a tough, all-weather camera with a full lens system behind it that won't break your back to haul into sports stadiums or forests or up into the mountains to chase extreme sports, the M1 Mark II was made for you, and you should buy it. If you don't go chasing surfers or soccer players, you're buying a beautifully made state-of-the-art photographic tool, second to none in looks, feel and performance. If you won't make use of the CAF performance, the M1 Mark II's differences from Olympus's own E-M5 Mark II or Panasonic's G80 are worthwhile but incremental, and the camera looks decidedly overpriced. I'm reminded of a letter that a motorcyclist wrote to Ducati in Italy, asking why, while most 1 litre motorcycles cost £8,000, a Ducati cost £16,000. They wrote back with a costing. To building a 1 litre motorcycle, £8,000. To knowing how to make it a Ducati, £8,000 total £16,000. There's a parallel here, I think. Thanks for watching.